Well, maybe I should begin by talking a little bit about how I got interested in working with colonial histories and archives. And part of it, I think that some of my inclination to do so has a theoretical basis, and some has to do with my kind of evolution as an artist intellectual. The theoretical basis is that when I was an undergraduate and graduate student, I was very interested in Michel Foucault's writings. And there is a lot of, he did an enormous amount of archival research and kind of retrieval of interesting historical documents that may not have entered into philosophical discourse prior to it. So, I was interested in his method of thinking and the purposes behind it. Also, after I got out, when I was in university, I didn't do any post-colonial study. So there, at that time, if you wanted to study anything so-called non-Western, you had to go to anthropology or to area studies and political science. And I was, studying film semiotics and looking at avant-garde art and literature, and so there was not there wasn't a meeting point. But I did join a reading group when I got out of school, and we were working through Fanon's text. This is the early 1980s. So with the reading group was looking at work by Fanon, and Fanon talks about, two issues with colonial history. One is the way that in colonial contexts and neo-colonial contexts that the colonials are, their own historical memory is suppressed by the imposition of a history that isn't their own in the educational system, right? So I was very aware of the way in which I was becoming very aware of the way that one's sense of identity is shaped by the education one has, and that if you are educated not to understand yourself in a certain way, then you're less inclined to do so, right? The other part of it was sort of the radical potential of historical retrieval of these suppressed collective experiences. Aside from that, there's also a practice in the post-war period in the States and in Europe of kind of reckoning with difficult histories through testament, through testimony. The Nuremberg Trials would be the classic German example of this. But during my childhood, during the Vietnam War, there was a group of Vietnam veterans who were against the war, who organized their own tribunals in which they confessed to their war crimes and to what they witnessed. And these were publicized, and there's an amazing film actually called Winter Soldier about this. And so and then there's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. So there is a precedent outside the realm of art of reckoning, right? Through testimony. And there's also an example from the early years of the war in Iraq of a group of artists who did a piece called 9 Scripts for a Nation at War, in which they took the records of testimony of prisoners of war in Bagram and Abu Ghraib and Gitmo and read them as a kind of collective performance. So I'm looking at all of this, right? And all of these precedents and ideas influence the decision that I am making to do the piece here. But I was also very influenced in the 80s by my work with the Black British artists who began a kind of cultural project of rethinking British imperial history by going back to the colonial archives. So, I met John Akomfra and Black Audio Film Collective in 1985. I met Isaac Julian and Sankofa around that time, and we began to work together. I would bring them to the States, they would bring me to the UK, I would write about them, and so on and so forth. And their project at that time, along with several other artists of their generation, was to rethink Britishness and to put the history of Blacks in Britain and Blacks influenced by the British into the history and into the culture by going back to the archive and teasing out the other stories, the stories of immigration, the stories of colonialism, the stories of slavery, and so on and so forth. So, these are formative relationships and formative educational experiences that influenced the decisions that I made when I was working with Guillermo Gomez Peña and we did the Undiscovered Amerindians piece. This came out of our research into the history of performance in an intercultural context and looking at what I understood to be involuntary performances by indigenous peoples who were put on display and forced to perform an idea of the exotic or an idea of the other for a European audience and then for an American audience. But to do that, we had to go into the records and find the evidence, which was there. But finding evidence is all about how you look. And at that time, at the time that I was doing this research, there were people in performance studies who were interested in interculturalism, but they were looking at interculturalism in a different way. They were looking at, whether it's like the Victor Turner, Richard Schechner way, or their disciples. They were looking at, great works from India, or how they could go into these contexts and become part of, a particular religious practice, like the way that Maya Deren went into Haiti, etc. And I wasn't looking at that kind of more peaceful, equitable relationship. I was looking at power relationships in which non-Westerners were put into a position of performing a particular role, because I felt that history had more to do with where we were in the present than the kind of fake notion of that everything is equal and that all cultures are equally appreciated. So anyway, that was where I started with all of this, and eventually, after I left that caged Amerindian project behind, and then I later on in the late '90s got involved in a very big research project that ended up as a photography exhibition called Only Skin Deep: Changing Visions of the American Self, when I went into the American archives to look at the history of how ideas about race had been shaped by different photographic practices. And even trying to make an argument then, I had to look across the entire country. That was I was bound by the obligations of certain funding from the government. So my proposal was to rethink what constituted the United States, because I wanted to include the territories that nobody ever talks about: American Samoa or the British Virgin Islands, or these other stories, right? And these other Americas, the Philippines, during 40 years of occupation, and I wanted to go there, and I also wanted to look at vernacular photographic practices that didn't usually make their way into an art exhibition about photography, hack studio portraits, or the kinds of Kodak pictures that American soldiers took in the South Pacific during the war. They took tons of pictures of, naked girls in the South Pacific, right, in Hawaii and American Samoa and elsewhere. And, to extend and expand into those areas was, made a lot of people sort of surprised, right? But, it was part of a project of trying to reconstruct and redefine a history of Americanness using photographic practice to tell a different story. So, I've been doing this kind of thing for a while. The opportunity, I had heard about the repatriation of the Namibian skulls in 2011, and I, immediately kind of started to try to dig for more information, and then found out about, that Charité had lots more remains, and so it kind of those details from those news stories around that time stayed in my mind, and I had, like, as I have for many different topics, folders in my hard drives and archives where like keep collecting stuff, Coco, until you have the opportunity to do something, right? And then this invitation came, and I did try initially to see if there was a way to get more access to the remains, but that is such a politically sensitive issue that it just didn't seem like it was going to be possible for me to be able to orchestrate something like that, especially from another continent. And but in the course of doing research, I came across the Blue Book, and precisely because the season at KW is supposedly inspired by this conceptual artist, Ian Wilson, who ironically is South African, even though he lives in the United States, and his work is focused specifically on the use of spoken language. I thought that it was appropriate to work with a text that was suppressed because of the spoken language component of the text more than anything else, because the outcry from Germany against the Blue Book report on the German treatment of the natives, much of the argument against it was focused on this idea that 47 natives had been interviewed and had given sworn affidavit testimony for the report. And so the German argument at the time was, natives don't understand what the truth is, they lie, they're not rational, you can't base a report condemning our practices based on the testimony of these people, and so on and so forth. So it seemed particularly appropriate to try to retrieve the spoken words of people, precisely because there was a political project behind suppressing them. So, my first visits to Berlin were in the 80s. I would come for the Berlin Film Festival, so I saw Berlin when the wall was still up. And, I remember one time being here with a writer, Hilton Als, who's writes now for the New Yorker. He's a theater critic for the New Yorker, and he is a cultural, very, very, very excellent cultural critic, and he's African American, and he's very tall. And I remember one time, we would be followed around, and especially him, this very, very tall black man, and followed in a way that made both of us really uncomfortable, and that made him really, really uncomfortable, where we just felt like we couldn't go anywhere without attracting an unwanted attention, like we were anomalies, right? Because we didn't look like Africans from Africa, and we also didn't look like American soldiers. And at the time, was the reference in Germany for black people. You were either a soldier stationed at one of the bases, or you were an African who was a refugee, or somebody who was coming to study in the East, or something like that. So I remember his discomfort and getting really disgusted about like just sort of like gesturing to people to leave him alone and to leave us alone. And I also remember a conversation with a film curator, saying, well, what are you guys complaining about? You're not starving in Somalia. So that was said, that to me was an indication of sort of where thinking was. It's not so much about, is this racism or not? Of course there's racism, but what form does it take? What is the understanding? And what I understood from a comment like that was that the notion was that suffering can only be measured in physical, hard fact ways. In other words, if you are, in a country that is overrun with authoritarian dictators and you're starving, then you have something to complain about, right? But the more intangible, more invisible effects of, institutional racism are not something that one can, and also the fetishization of people, right? The flip side of racism, where there's this kind of perverse fascination with otherness, which was very present, in German advertising at the time and so on. That's not something to discuss. And some years after that, in the early '90s, I came to Germany for a film festival in Oberhausen, and the director of the festival had wanted to do a focus on African diaspora and asked different people to select films from different regions. And so I was bringing the American selection, somebody else was doing the Caribbean, somebody else was doing South America, somebody else was doing Africa, and so on. And so I chose a lot of independent, small-scale pieces, thinking that would be appropriate for a short film festival. And this was right after the Rodney King incident. And I remember that there was a piece in there that was about, that how many times he was beaten in how many minutes and so on and so forth. Anyway, the audience reactions were so, how to put it, like dismissive and negative in this way that was much stronger than I would have experienced, I think, in the U.S., because people with that attitude just wouldn't show up for a festival about black film in the U.S. But people would just say things like, "We don't, you want to talk about race, and we don't accept discussions here of race because any racial discourse is a racist discourse, and this is not we're not having it," that kind of thing. And then after the screenings were over, the director kind of pulled me in and said, we would never show anything of such poor quality. I mean, it was this kind of classic case of, this kind of severity, like we're going to dismiss you and we're going to use quality on the base as the basis for this. But obviously, I knew what was behind it, right? It was just this incredible psychic wall of resistance to addressing certain kinds of issues and to looking at parallels, but that it was easier to use the argument that this is not of sufficient quality to merit our consideration. So, that's and then from there, like in the '90s, I would just kind of laugh with friends and say, well, if I come to Germany, I know I'm going to get yelled at. Like, just get ready, put on your boxing gloves, put on your protection, your protective gear, and just go in there and like get ready for the, And so I went through about 15 years of people just, like always coming with this like avalanche of qualitative criticism. But at the same time, I would occasionally be called by, young Afro-Germans who would say like, we don't, where do we start? Like help, right? And it was clear that they felt isolated and that also that they didn't feel any institutional support for the concerns that they had that were really derived more from just, hey, we don't even know how to define an Afro-German presence here, right? My sense was that things started to change in the noughts, and the nature of my invitations also started to change. And I think that some of that is the product of shifting demographics. That, finally a generation, the children of immigrants were kind of growing up and entering into institutions of higher learning and making certain demands for areas of study and so on. And so that, you could kind of build a discourse based on a kind of dialogue between more open-minded professoriate and a student body that wants a different kind of thing. And also, there are more general continental trends, right? I mean, British cultural theory from Birmingham School eventually got to Germany, right? So I think that a lot of scholars are influenced by that kind of inquiry. And my Black artist friends in Britain started kind of giggling. We started giggling about, German graduate students showing up in London, everybody wanting to do research on the Blacks, right? So like we saw the change, we saw things changing. So by the time I, got invitations to come here in, 2011, 2012, things were very different. The interest was different. The people inviting me were different. The concerns were different. And I think that the fact that now I'm working on a piece here that is about German colonialism, and that, I have a response from many sectors of interest in the subject and an openness and willingness to talk about things, and a bunch of participants, the overwhelming majority of whom are ethnically German but want to discuss German colonialism, is an indication of that shift in attitude. So I received this invitation to come to KW last year when Chris knew that he was taking over and was planning his season. He wanted to open his first season with a kind of homage to Ian Wilson, this conceptual artist who worked on language. And so there are some exhibitions that are on display here, but there are also a series of performances that were commissioned as part of this season. And so I felt I wanted to try to find a way to make my own interests coincide with the overarching theme of the place, of the season, which is about spoken language. And as I was saying before, originally I wanted to try to find a way to get to the bones, because I know that there are still remains here that were taken from what was German Southwest Africa. And I knew that some of the skulls that had already been repatriated had writing on them, and I wanted to be able to read the remains and see what else was written. But this is a very, very sensitive issue. Every attempt that I made, and that people helping me tried to make on my behalf, we were stonewalled, blocked completely from access to the remains. So there are some academics here who tried to help in that they gave me literature that they had about it, but there wasn't a kind of record of the writing on the remains. So anyway, I was starting to worry a little bit about what I was going to be able to do, and in the course of researching, I came across references to this blue book that was published in 1918, and then I got interested in the possibilities of using elements of the text. Okay, so the blue book is a generic term for reports produced for the British Parliament. There are many blue books, okay? But this particular report was commissioned by British Parliament in 1915, and it was a report on German treatment of the natives in Southwest Africa. This report was part of an attempt by the British government to rationalize the taking of colonies away from Germany after World War I. So we're talking about the period of the end of the war going into the Treaty of Versailles, right? And, oh, that's me. Sorry. Let me just go back. So we're talking here about the end of the First World War and going into the Treaty of Versailles, when Germany loses its colonies in Africa. And political arguments were generated in order to support this move of the taking away of the colonies. And there were many publications produced during this time period in the UK that were extremely unfavorable to Germany about what was happening in the colonies. Now, it's not as if the British were saints or the Belgians were any better or anything like that, but we have a political moment in which it becomes expedient to gather information about colonial practice, okay? Information that isn't the typical colonial records that makes everything seem very orderly and rational. So some military officers of the British Army were dispatched to gather testimony about what had happened. This is happening already 10 years or more after the rebellions that lead to eventually von Trotta coming into Southwest Africa and issuing the extermination orders and the genocide, right? So we're talking about, that's happening in 1904, and we're talking now about 1915 to 1918 when this is being gathered. This information is being gathered and put together. The report relied on written documents as well, and I have some of the testimony and documents to be read for the performance are not sworn affidavits but letters and records that were produced during the time period. There's excerpts from the memoir of one of the governors, Lutwein's memoir about being a governor in Southwest Africa, and so on. But there is native testimony. Now, when I say native testimony, you have to remember that in what was German Southwest Africa, there were several indigenous groups at the time vying for control of territories, right? So it was not just the Herero, there was the Herero and the Nama, there was the group of people that the Germans referred to as the Bushmen, right? There was also a group of people who were referred to as the bastards, who were the children and grandchildren of German settlers with African women, because most of the settlers who came to farm came without women. They were men coming without women, right? And so they would take concubines and often take wives away from Africans, and this was a source of tremendous tension, and it was one of the reasons for the rebellion. But their children would sometimes have German names, right, were lighter skinned, spoke German, and lived separately, like formed their own kind of subculture. And there were actually some attempts during the colonial period by German fathers to legitimate their children so that they could inherit land or to send them to Germany to be educated. So that's a group that allied with the Germans during the war against the Herero and were often put in the position of middlemen, very much in the same way as in the Caribbean and in the American South, that mulattos, as we say in Spanish, right, mixed race people would be the overseers on the plantations, right? So anyway, so some of the testimony is from these so-called bastards who remember and recall, I was in charge of whipping, I was in charge of, opening the prison, I was there, I survived because I was supposed to be allied with the Germans, but I walked away from this because of the things that I saw and that were extremely disturbing to me, right? So there's some of this in the testimony. So anyway, this report has all these different kinds of voices, right? And so it occurred to me that it would be an interesting way to remember the past would be to extract that testimony from the report. The narrative written by the British is very tendentious and is very, sort of florid and makes it seem like, nobody else in the world ever thought of having a labor camp or of quelling an insurrection with state-sponsored violence, which is not true, right? But the tendentiousness of the British writing is one thing. The testimony is testimony, as far as I'm concerned, right? So I started to extract, and then I saw that some texts were cited, but not completely. There would be a gloss, or there would just be a one-line quote, and so in some cases it was useful to go back and get a larger excerpt to make more sense of it. So in the Witbui letters, for example, I went to the collection of letters to get the full letters rather than just a sentence, because then you get a much better sense of why he is such an outstanding figure and why the Germans were so kind of confused by this African man who refused to see himself as inferior no matter what they did to him. So anyway, I ended up putting together a kind of collage of these texts. Now, the Blue Book was produced in 1918. The Germans published a response in which they criticized it heavily as tendentious, said, the British were no better as colonizers, and also ripped into it because they, as the Germans argued, it relied on native testimony, and natives lie and they don't understand the truth, what the truth is, and they're irrational, and so on and so forth. So then it seemed particularly significant to me that they were so obsessed with suppressing native testimony. In any case, 8 years later, in 1926, by this time, the white settlers were of Southwest Africa, and South Africa were kind of blending together. It was the Afrikaners, the German, and the British, and it was more politically expedient at that point to have solidarity among whites over and against the blacks than it was to single out the Germans as particularly venomous in the way that they engage in colonial practice. So at that point, a decision is made, an official legislative decision was made to destroy the Blue Book. So I have the pronouncement from the German Southwest African Legislative Assembly in which they say, we're going to get rid of all these. Everything's going to be destroyed here in Southwest Africa. So supposedly, that they got rid of all the copies in libraries, bookstores, and in the official records. However, the British Home Office keeps all its Blue Books. So I know for sure that a copy was kept in Britain. Now, whether there were copies hidden in what we now know to be Namibia, I don't know. But there was the pronouncement of the suppression. And it seemed to me that erasure of the African voice was similar to the sort of topographic recognition of history in Namibia, in that in Windhoek there is a big statue to the German soldiers who died in the rebellion, but there's no official memorial to the 80,000 Herero and Nama who perished in this conflict. And so anyway, what I noticed in the research that I did was that by the 1960s and 70s, there were Marxist historians in Germany, mostly in the East, who were writing about the history of German imperialism and in support of the Namibian struggle for independence, because remember, Namibia was the last country in Africa to achieve independence in 1990, that were mentioning the Blue Book in their accounts and talking about Witbooi. And so that's the first references that I found, chronologically to the Blue Book. The records of German imperialism were in the East, so I think that maybe those historians had better access to the historical record. But I think it was also ideologically more in the interests of the East German Marxists to kind of stress that they had a negative account of German imperialism. And then after independence, what I find is that in the attempt to kind of do a revisionist history of Namibia and the long struggle for independence, that it becomes more important to, and this is also around the end of apartheid, to begin to gather the documents that show this, century-long struggle, right? And in that regard, there was some Namibian historians who put together an annotated version of the Blue Book, which I believe came out in the 90s. I found a digital copy of it. So that was the first access I had. And then, digging more, then I find the original, right, that is now digitized, and the German response. And there are lots of government document archives where you can get these things, right? It's not like you don't walk into a bookstore and find it on sale. But if you are I have an academic affiliation. I'm at a research institution, so I can go to the government documents archivist and historian, and they can show me how to find these things. So they're out there, right? Of course, when I first mentioned the Blue Book, the first reaction they got, well, it's very tendentious. I said, well, of course, what isn't tendentious, right? And I said, yes, but I'm not interested in the British propaganda. I'm interested in the testimony, right? And which is not, as far as I'm concerned, it's not propagandistic, right? I mean, then the Nuremberg Trials are propagandistic. I mean, it's testimony, right? And it is a very rare instance of the testimonial narratives by Africans who experienced colonial violence. There's not a lot of that available. Most of the records of colonial wars are written by the colonizers. So anyway, that's how my idea for the piece evolved. And as I pulled the testimony, I started to see, like, okay, I wanted to cover the different key issues. One is sort of the arguments over what is protection, right? What constitutes German protection, and how did the Africans perceive German protection, and why would anybody have agreed to it? Because every group in the end signed an agreement for protection. What did they understand that to be, and what were the concerns, right? And then what were the problems that emerge as protection expands? And it's sort of the classic things of the traders come in. First the British, and then other traders come in and get people hooked on the drugs of the time, which were alcohol and ammunition, guns. The guns were good for getting natives to fight with each other in very destructive ways, and then the Europeans can just sort of stand back and watch it happen, right, and reap the benefits of this. So you see that, but very quickly what started to happen was that the traders implemented credit systems that were completely manipulative. So if you needed to have a pair of shoes, a trader would say, well, if you can pay me now with 2 cows, because they didn't have any currency. Their currency was cattle. That's their wealth, right? So if you can pay me with 2 cows now, but if you can't pay me now, then you're going to have a debt, and that with a credit system that, in 6 months it will be 4 cows, and in a year it'll be 6 cows, and so on and so forth. So the settlers who were coming wanted cattle. They wanted to farm. They couldn't bring cows from Germany. So and the Herero owned all the cows, right? So the traders were part of this manipulative strategy to basically impoverish the Africans, right? To force them to become laborers, because the Germans needed laborers and they needed cattle. So you had to take their cattle away. So you have to create a system of rules that eventually forces a transfer of all of the wealth over to the Germans. So I have some accounts both on the German side of saying, oh, the Hereros are so stupid, they don't really understand what's happening, and the Hereros saying, no, we understand what's happening, and these guys are being really unfair. So anyway, I have some about trade, and then some also about how the strategies that the Germans used to get access to more and more land. Because part of what's happening is settlers are starting to come more and more. From Germany, they're being sold land that the German protection agreements didn't actually give them rights to. So this was going to produce a conflict no matter what, right? Because these farmers are coming expecting to have plots of land, and then the Africans are like, wait a minute, we didn't agree for you to have this, right? But so the Germans are coming and saying, well, I have a paper that says that I own this, and the Africans are like, wait a second, we have to have a place where we can feed our cattle, where we can water our cattle, and so on. So I tried to find documents that would show this this process of the slow transfer of land, right? The transfer of cattle, the transfer of land, and the increasing frustration of the Africans who are losing everything, right? Which was not the way that they understood the original agreement. So we got that, and then we move into the reasons for the rebellion, right? Why actually 2 warring groups, the Nama and Herero, decide at a certain point that they're just going to it's Maharero and Witboi saying to each other, okay, they're going to kill us, we're going to die fighting. And this is why, right? And then you get the witnesses to the atrocities of war. So it's, the German soldiers' attacks on civilians, the rounding up and ambushing of leaders, the promise that they're coming to negotiate and they're actually being rounded up to be executed, this kind of thing, the description of the labor camps, that I got description of the prisons. So you get a kind of view of all the different horrors, right, of the war. And then also the period, the transitional period after the war to the final British takeover, where you have, on the one hand, the German settlers arguing that they need to maintain the right to beat their workers. And on the other hand, the magistrates saying, the Germans are being too violent and will never get anybody to agree to this political situation unless there's more of a rule of law, right? And so that's where things end, because the British come and take over. So that I wanted to try to get as panoramic a view out of those testimonies as possible, and also give a little bit of ideological framing of it. So what is the military strategy that Ludwig describes? What is the rationale from the German government and also from the philosophers who were producing the supporting arguments, the what is it called, Lebensraum, this idea of that you have to expand, and also these concepts of, the natives have no idea of what property is and they don't really understand anything, so you don't really have to worry too much about them, kind of thing. So that's what I tried to do with the book. This is not the first time that I have arrived in a different country to address a problem that isn't exclusively or specifically an American problem, right? And so I have some experience in dealing with the kinds of questions that arise. You're an outsider. Why are you coming here to talk to us about this? Or another version of that question is, well, you're not African. Why are you talking about Africa, right? And I've gone through this before, like, what was I doing in the UK, or why am I in Cuba if I live in the United States, or what, when I was doing the Caged Amerindian project with Guillermo, why were we in Australia? And my approach to this is, has a lot of different elements, but one is simply to say, this is not just African history, it's German history also. But it's also world history. Colonialism is not a specifically German issue. Mistreatment of natives is not a specifically German thing, but I can find examples that are particularly pertinent in this context, and that seemed appropriate to do here. With the Caged Amerindian project, we were looking at a practice that was very widespread across different colonial territories, and what we had to do was to go and speak to representatives of the cultures that had been put on display, to talk to them about, what were their, what did they have to say about it. And in each case, I talked to Native American tribal leaders. We had to negotiate with Australian Aboriginal activists who worked with the Natural History Museum there. We had different people to address, in addition to having to deal with governmental people in many different contexts, including Washington, to be able to put the piece in different contexts. And, in each case, I was never told, you can't talk about this. We were always told, you need to do these things, right? You need to acknowledge the way in which this affected us, or you need to avoid doing things in a particular way, or you are not here to pretend to be us, but you can speak about the situation. So, I've kind of been in these kinds of conversations for most of my professional life, trying to find a way to work together, right? And to share knowledge. So that's that's how I approach it. And the same way here is to find people who have a stake in the history, who have an interest in the history, and to find a way to make peace with that, right? So why do these things? Well, why? I mean, there are so many artists who work with historical narratives and colonial archives, and I'm just one of those people. This is the kind of material that I want to sculpt, right, and to rework into artworks. And I don't feel like that's such an anomalous practice. Different artists have different way. I mean, Fiona Tan, who works in the Netherlands, she works with a lot of colonial archival film, and there are other artists who also work with a lot of film stuff. The Black British artists at different points have worked with a lot of colonial archival materials or recreations. So, I'm not alone. And there also are many artists who work with official state documents. And I've done that in relation to post-revolutionary Cuban history as well, in part because they are so full of stories that have not been told, and in part because in some cases they've been strategically suppressed or are controlled, particularly in authoritarian regimes. There's a lot of kind of restrictions on what you can access from government archives, right? And so that what that does is it produces more of a desire to access them. And in some cases, like in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union, these archives become public after the end of a political era, and then many artists go to them, to the KGB files or the East German, was it the Stasi police, and look for material with which to make artworks. And it's the same with the colonial archives. This Blue Book is not the only colonial document to have been suppressed. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago in New York and talking to a colleague of mine, Stephen Nelson, who works on African art history, and he had done a lot of doctoral research in Cameroon. And he said, he found lots of evidence of, this document has been reviewed, this removed, this document has been destroyed, this document is no longer here. So there were attempts at different points in colonial history to erase evidence of atrocity or to erase evidence that was prejudicial to the colonizer, right? This is not the only instance. So why is this, why is there a kind of a battleground in the present day over what to study? Well, what you understand about your past has a lot to do with how you understand yourself in the present. There, even in my own upbringing, I was a child in the 1960s and 70s. I was fortunate enough to be a scholarship kid at a private school, so I got a good education, and my professors or my teachers were pretty liberal. But what we were taught about slavery was, limited, and the worst violence was not part of what you teach children. What we learned about segregation was also quite limited. The focus was much more on the ending of things than on the experience of oppression, right? As sort of, the Civil War was fought to free the slaves, right? The Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court desegregated public schools and so the impression you get as a child is that there is this forward march toward equality, right? Civil Rights Act and so on and so forth. At the same time, I remember the killing of Martin Luther King, the killing of Malcolm X, the riots when I was a kid. And so that, that my own life experience was showing that it wasn't a completely painless march forward. But I've also witnessed in my lifetime how, you go 2 steps forward and then you go 1 step back, and then you go 2 steps forward and then you go 3 steps back. And right now in the US, we're in a move backward. And one of the areas that is subject to a lot of kind of political debate is what students are what they should be studying and how they should be studying it. And there are battles in many states in the United States about what you can teach about, for example, Mexican American history, or what you can say about the internment camps where the 100,000 or so Japanese Americans were held during the Second World War. And there are politicians that don't want any references made to the camps, the American camps. There are others that don't want any suggestion that the United States stole half of Mexico, which is in fact what happened. There are, there was just a move to forbid the use of writings by the radical historian Howard Zinn in the public schools in Arizona, because he published The People's History of the United States, and they were supposedly not, these high school students should not have access to these points of view because there are conservatives that see this as un-American, right? So, when you produce when you produce an educational system through censoring the narratives that doesn't allow students to know about things, then they're less likely to question. They're also more likely to look upon those critical narratives as un-American or unpatriotic, or you can replace American with any other nationality that you want. But it's much harder to be sympathetic to the demands of subalterns within your country or outside your country if you have no idea why they're making those demands, right? And so I think that's the sort of the political rationale for controlling access to the information. There are a lot of other arguments that have gone on since throughout my entire life as a student and as a professor about, if you teach Entezaki Shange or if you teach Alice Walker, then you're not going to be able to teach them Shakespeare, or you're not going to be able to teach them Milton, and they really need to know, it's more important for students to read Milton or Shakespeare than it is to read Toni Morrison's literature. And I don't see it as an either or situation. But that is often how the debate is framed within sort of knowledge-producing institutions like schools and universities. So anyway, I don't know if that is enough of an answer. There are times when I'm just focused on doing activist things. I was even in college, when I got to university, was the period of the student movement to force universities to divest from South Africa. And I remember arriving at Brown University, where I was an undergraduate, and there was the whole kind of campus green. So the lawn in the middle of where the buildings were built around was full of students who were camped out there, to force the university, the board of trustees, to divest its holdings in South Africa. And then my sophomore year, I think it was, the second year, the big issue was nuclear power plants in the region, and going and trying to force a shutdown so that we could stop the development of nuclear power. And then by the time I was finishing university, the focus of political activism was on the U.S. involvement in Central America and getting the CIA, because this was when the nuns were massacred and the paramilitary squads were killing thousands and thousands of people in El Salvador and Guatemala. And so I'm involved in all of this. So, I kind of understood that this was, part of your life was to be politically engaged. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that I wasn't making artworks about these things. I was just engaging, and I participated in the big kind of marches against nuclear power and for a greener planet, and then got involved in some of the efforts against the Contra War in Nicaragua. So, but I wasn't necessarily making artwork about these things. I mean, and part of that was about sort of trying to mature and develop my own understanding of a practice and what to do with it. I think that there are times when I have kept the two endeavors separate, and there are times when the connections are more clear. My concern, well, I have a number of concerns. Sometimes there are issues that you just need to address in a very quickly in a specific moment, and there isn't really a time to think about the art part. So there's that, and there's also what are the contexts for the reception of art, and sometimes you need more time, or you need to create more space for people to be able to have an aesthetic experience that is not a simplistic one, right? Because there's a way in which sometimes activism is very reactive and short-lived, right? And one would like an art endeavor to have a longer life, and also sometimes the experience of reception and the road to understanding of a work can take much longer. So that, for example, when in the mid-noughts, when I was working on the project about military interrogation and the use of female sexuality as a weapon against supposed Muslim terrorists, yes, it was a response to the war, but the purpose of the project was not to get you to leave the theater and go out and do something specific. It was to think and to reflect on what was happening in a deeper way than just going out to march. Because this was a period in which in US jurisprudence, legal arguments were being introduced to legalize torture. And this was really, I mean, besides, of course I marched against the war in 2003. Of course I was against the war, but I was also against something that was much broader that what I saw happening in the political landscape, which was the re-legitimation of wartime practices that had been delegitimated in the post-war era. When you create laws that make it okay to torture, you lose the ability legally to fight it, right? That it's going to happen, it's going to happen. But if you create laws that support that, then you cannot struggle against it anymore. So, I was thinking about that. I was also thinking during this time period about the way in which neoliberal political ideology had been so good at absorbing certain discourses about identity and difference, and that there were there were ways in which you could have a feminism that was in support of far-right causes, right? So you could have a situation, as we had during the Bush administration, in which the chain of command for, using sexual harassment of men by women as torture was being legitimized all the way up to the top by women. Not only by men, but it was Condoleezza Rice, and then it's Rumsfeld's assistants who were all women, and then the brigadier generals who were women. So all the way down the line, it's all women supporting a kind of instrumentalization of female sexuality as a weapon, right? I found that a kind of symbolic of something that was happening in the larger culture. So, those were the kinds of things that I wanted to think about. That's a project that I was working on for 4 years. And that's not a kind of activist, reactive model of working. So I do think that there are times when, that if you're going to make an art project about something and you want it to be lasting and meaningful as an aesthetic experience, that it's not going to work to just be purely reactive. And then there's one other, kind of issue that has to do with how the art world deals with this notion of activism in art is always cast in a very negative light. Always. It's always framed as propagandistic and insufficiently sophisticated to constitute a valid aesthetic experience, right? If you're going to do activism, then you're going to make something simple that is not going to have a long life. There isn't a positive interpretive discourse in art for activist engagement. So, because then, to call something activist engagement is to give it a kind of functionalist cast. And, for art to be art in aesthetics theory, it has to be disassociated from from use value, right? It's only exchange value. It's only symbolic value. So, I have to be very careful about how I frame what I do in those contexts, and try to argue sometimes that maybe there are aesthetic experiences that we don't understand to have a functionalist purpose, but that do have a functionalist purpose to make you complacent or to distract you, right? That activism isn't just about people who want to change a political landscape. It's also can be about rationalizing complacency. So to broaden the argument and not reduce the notion of the function of art to only that which is read as overtly political.